Those who suffered most were Muslims, but it is wrong to portray a universal disaster as the suffering of any one group. It is important, however, to see the context of the movement of the Armenians and the Muslims in World War I. They were part of a long history of movement of peoples in which all suffered from dislocation and privation. Although the fact is seldom mentioned in popular literature, the Armenians were by no means the only ones who were forced from their lands in the war. In fact, the first forced migrations were of Muslims, moved by the Russians from the borders of the Ottoman Empire. The next and largest migration was also of Muslims. When more than 1 million people, more than 1 million Muslims, were forced west when the Russians and their Armenian allies invaded the Erzurum, Bitlis, and Van provinces. When the Russians invaded, the Armenians of Van were triumphant, but their triumph was short-lived. Armenians, undoubtedly fearing Muslim reprisals, fled alongside the Russians when the Russians were briefly defeated by Ottoman forces. The Armenians came to the southern Caucasus. When the Russians once again defeated the Ottoman army and once again conquered eastern Anatolia, they allowed only a small number of Armenians to return to their homes. The Russians wanted the land for themselves. The Russians said they wanted an Armenia without Armenians. Of the 350,000 Armenians who fled to Russia, half did not live out the war. They died of starvation and disease. The Muslim refugees suffered much the same fate. They first fled the Russians and the Armenians, some returning when the Ottoman army was briefly successful, then fleeing once again. Like the Armenians, their death toll was horrific. In the province of Van, nearly 2/3 of the Muslims were dead by the end of the war. There can be no doubt that the Ottoman Empire did not intend the extermination of the Armenians. Overwhelming archival documentation demonstrates that the government had no such intention. Instead, orders were given for food, shelter, and protection for the Armenian migrants. But even if one doubts this record, one fact proves that extermination was not intended: the survival of those who were most under Ottoman government control. Armenians in major cities were neither moved nor persecuted. Armenians in Istanbul, Izmir, Edirne survived in their homes throughout the war because they were not considered a threat. They were not moved. Those who were moved also largely survived. The best evidence we have is that 80% of those relocated survived their journeys, survived their forced migration. A 20% death rate is horrible, but it is not extermination. Of course, great numbers of Armenians died of disease after they reached their locations. They died of cholera, typhus, dysentery, spotted fever. The Ottomans did what they could to aid them, but there was little that could be done. Ottoman soldiers and Muslim civilians were also dying of disease in great number, and disease did not care about the religion of its victims. Realizing that they could not take care of the transferred Armenians, the Ottomans allowed American missionary relief organizations to aid the Armenians. Missionaries provided medicine, tents, housing, bread to the Armenians. Americans donated almost $90 million, which today would be about $3 billion, to aid the Armenians. And it should be noted that in all but a very few cases, the missionaries aided only Christians. They fed Christians, they housed Christians, but not Muslims, who were also dying of disease and hunger. Would the Ottomans have allowed the missionaries to keep the Armenians alive if the Ottomans wanted the Armenians to die? The Ottomans allowed the missionaries to aid the Armenians even though there were starving Muslims in the same regions. The Ottomans allowed the missionaries to do this because they knew the missionaries would never aid the Turks. and they wanted to make sure that the Armenians, at least, would live. This does not mean that the Ottomans were completely without guilt. They were guilty of indecision and ineptitude that caused the deaths of both Turks and Armenians. Wartime conditions were greatly confused. In some places, orders went first to move Armenians, then the orders were countermanded and the Armenians were sent back, then later put into effect again and the Armenians were sent away. Confusion reigned. Many Armenians were forced to walk to Syria. Others went by first-class railroad carriages. Worst of all, there was not enough food and medicine, either for the Armenians, the Muslim refugees, or even the army. Jamal Pasha, the governor of Syria, took food from the army to feed the Armenians, but it was never enough. The reason for all this, the reason was the weakness of the empire. There were not enough soldiers and gendarmes to protect either the Muslims or the Armenians. There was not enough food, not enough medicine. The war itself was the reason for the suffering of both the Muslims and the Armenians. Now, it has been argued that the Ottomans simply should have remained neutral, but they really had no choice. If Russia won the war, they would have taken much of the Ottoman Empire, dispossessed the Muslims, as they had been doing for a century. Russia's allies would probably have taken the rest. It made no difference if the Ottomans were neutral or combatants. The result would have been the same. Defeating the Russians was the Ottomans' only choice. They had no choice but to do what they could to defeat the Russian Empire. Evil deeds were done by both sides in the war. Some Turks and Kurds were guilty of crimes against Armenians. Even government officials were guilty. They acted from hatred and a desire for revenge, or from greed, or from many other base emotions. In some places, particularly the Dersim region, tribes and bandits did massacre Armenians. The Ottoman government did not properly protect many of the Armenians. The soldiers and the gendarmes who would have been needed to protect the Armenians were fighting the Russians. In the first year of the war, Armenians engaged in mass slaughter of Muslims, especially in the Van and Bitlis provinces, northeastern Erzurum province, and the Marash-Zeytun area. When Russian troops left the battlefield in the Russian Revolution, their place was taken by Armenians. These proceeded to massacre Muslims in the northeast. When the Armenians were defeated by the Ottomans, the retreating Armenians destroyed everything in their path of retreat, killing whichever Muslims could not escape. The best example of the intentions of the Armenian nationalists came from Kars, Ardahan, Eastern Erzurum province, and Nakhchivan. Here, over to here. These areas had been in Russia. They had been in the Russian Empire. It is often said that Armenians who attacked Muslims did it out of revenge for what had been done to Armenians. In fact, the Turks of these areas had never fought against Armenians in 1950 or 1960. They had been under Russian control. They had not relocated a single Armenian. The Armenians had no reason to take revenge on these Turks, yet they slaughtered these Turks in great numbers, burned down Turkish villages, destroyed Turkish cities. This was not revenge, it was murder. Both sides committed atrocities. However, there is one great difference between the murder of Armenians and the murder of Muslims. The Ottoman government did what it could to punish those who attacked or did not properly defend the Armenians. 2,000 Turks, Kurds, were tried for crimes against Armenians. Many were executed. Even one governor was executed, and another governor committed suicide before the punishment could be performed. Obviously, this is the numbers of people that were tried in various provinces. Obviously, out of the millions involved in the war, more were guilty, but escaped judgment. It should be known, however, that the Ottomans did what they could. How many Armenians or Russians were tried and imprisoned for crimes against the Turks? Not one. How many of those who slaughtered the Muslims of Van, Bitlis, Erzurum, how many of these were executed? Not one. One set of statistics illustrates the real situation. Armenians did lose a slightly greater proportion of their population in the war because they lost the war. But in some reasons, Muslim loss was even greater. As I told you, nearly 2/3 of the Muslim population of Van province died in the war. Obviously, the green Muslims, the blue, the Armenians. This was obviously not a disaster for only one group. It was not a sectarian disaster. It was not an Armenian disaster. It was a human disaster. Now, the ancestors of today's Turks know this story, knew this story. They had lived through the murders, the rapes, and the destruction. Many of them could only escape attacks by Armenians by fleeing to the mountains, where many of them starved. They told their stories to their children and to their grandchildren, but sadly, this history has remained only in those families. No one in the outside world heard their story, and it must be admitted, no one cared. Only recently have even the Turks began to study the massacres done by Armenians